Hey guys, it is that time again for me to record this lecture and hope that somebody's watching it. Well, this week is the Civil War, the big one, and I need to try and keep this to 45 minutes. So, let's begin. And as always, please check your discussion questions for the day. There's a big announcement that I have just posted, and I need to stop doing all these uhs and ums and stop and goes. So please do your homework. Please do all the assignments. Huge announcement regarding the research paper just because of all the libraries closing. Make sure that you have your slideshow ready when we begin because we're going to be going over it and I'll be expanding upon it at least a little bit. So here we go. All right, so the 1860 election rolls around. It's Abraham Lincoln, a moderate Republican. He's running on infrastructure. He's running on education. He's running on a distaste for slavery, but he's seen as the least radical of the various Republican candidates. And he's from the West. He's from Illinois. He's not a Northerner. And that's seen as a plus in terms of trying to court the voters in the South. He is not that popular. The Democrats seem to have him well beat. And this is where the Democrats' ability to screw up any election ever comes in, even over 100 and even about 160 years ago. During this election, the Democratic Party has two candidates that they were looking at, John C. Breckinridge and Stephen Douglas. Well, Stephen Douglas of Illinois wins, and he is a Westerner, not a Southerner. And he refuses to adopt a policy of extending slavery into territories that explicitly do not want slavery. That's how far gone the South has become at this point. The Southern Democrats will not accept a candidate or want a candidate that does not support forcing the new territories to become slave states in order to preserve and empower the South and their giant, decades-long temper tantrum. Well, as a response to this, the Southern faction of Democrats sneak out of the convention in the middle of the night, ride hard for South Carolina, because where else would they go? And they decide that they're going to run John C. Breckinridge against Stephen Douglas in the election. So it becomes a three-way election between a Southern Democrat, a Western Democrat, and Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency with just under 40% of the vote. So their paranoia, their need to control everything and push slavery all the time backfires tremendously and gets the very first Republican president elected. So, on November 6th, 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency. And December 20th, just over a month later, South Carolina secedes from the Union. Abraham Lincoln is not the president yet. He has not said anything about secession, about abolition. He has not said anything about ending slavery. They just start jumping the gun. On January 9th, Mississippi secedes. January 10th, then Florida. The 11th, Alabama. The 19th, Georgia. The 26th, Louisiana. And on February 1st, Texas goes. And it isn't until March 4th, more than a month later, that Abraham Lincoln is sworn in as the President of the United States. So when you hear these Southerners talk about Abraham Lincoln was going to take away their rights or their property or big government, blah, 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 Abraham Lincoln isn't even freaking president yet, and they've already committed treason and jumped the gun. This whole time, President James Buchanan basically doesn't do anything. They allow them to overrun federal lands, steal the weapons out of the arsenals, force the garrisons to surrender, and Abraham Lincoln screaming at him, do something, do something. You can't let this happen. And Buchanan, being another pro-Southern lackey, essentially, in the government, in the pocket of Big Cotton, just sits there and twiddles his thumbs while the South gets himself in a position to create the Civil War. In February of 1861, the Confederate States of America is formally founded, and Jefferson Davis of Alabama is made president, and I believe Mobile, Alabama is made as the capital. On April 12th, Brigadier General Beauregard of the Confederate States of America demands Fort Sumter surrender. They refuse, and Beauregard fires on Fort Sumter, and this begins the American Civil War. Can you see how the North was so aggressive here in refusing to surrender their fort with their men in it? It's almost as if maybe the South started the Civil War and were the aggressors the whole time. Weird. Okay, in the aftermath of Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls on about 75,000 volunteers to subdue the Southerners. There's a panic. They rush militia troops from New York and Maryland and New York and New Jersey into Maryland in order to stop Maryland from turning traitor, because it's a slave state and Washington, D.C. is surrounded by Maryland and Virginia. If Maryland had been allowed to go over to the side of the South, then the Civil War would be essentially over and D.C. would fall. Well, knowing that the North was calling upon the other states who raised troops to try and defeat the Confederacy, Virginia on April 17th, Arkansas on May 16th, and North Carolina May 20th, and then finally Tennessee on June 8th, secede from the Union and support slavery instead of supporting the United States. The Union occupies Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri because they are slave states that have not yet flipped, and they are desperately terrified that these states will join the Confederacy. West Virginia, which secedes from the secessionist Virginia in 1863, was not invited to the vote in Richmond to see if Virginia would secede from the Union or not, because it was a non-slave-holding region. It does not acknowledge Virginia's secession and stays loyal to the Union, and is an area of constant battle in the mountains throughout the war. I've got a slide here quoting the cornerstone speech from the American Yawp, which is an online textbook, which I highly recommend if you just want a really good history textbook and not having to pay for it, which I'm usually a pretty big fan of. I recommend reading it because there's a lot of question the South wasn't about slavery. It was about freedom and states' rights and blah, 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 blah. Read the cornerstone speech. It's pretty obvious that the vice president of the Confederacy, Andrew Stevens, definitely knew what he was fighting for and what the Civil War was about. There's not a lot of doubt on that score, amongst other people who just don't want to get the point or have an invested interest in assuming that there's no racism and no slavery anywhere. So what's the North's response? Shock, anger, horror, mostly about the fact that there's a war on and there's disunion. Certain areas like New York New York City specifically, are pretty pro-Southern. These people are called Copperheads. As to slavery, I mean, there's the abolitionists, but largely it's the last thing on anybody's minds. Slavery is bad, but so what? The big question is, what do we do about disunion? And the North is not nearly as passionate about this whole Civil War idea as the South is, and they run into pretty hard problems finding recruits because of this. And eventually they will have to resort to a draft in order to get the amount of troops that they need. So, how is the North going to deal with the slavery problem? And they see it as a problem, not a injustice, not a moral imperative to be destroyed, a problem. And initially, the Lincoln administration decides that they just won't have a policy. They'll let every officer and general and governor deal with slavery however they see fit. And you end up with some generals giving the slaves back to the Confederate officers that they were defeating at the end of battles, and all kinds of madness. Eventually, they passed the Confiscation Acts of 1861 and 1862, which allowed for the freeing of slaves captured during the course of military operations. And some generals are very much into the whole abolition thing. General Saxton wished to give captured property to freed slaves, and General William Tecumseh Sherman, one of my favorite Civil War officers, even though he gets a very bad rap because of Sherman's march, which people claim burned places on all kinds of spots where that it never even touched. The hysteria around Sherman's march is amazing, but we'll get to that later. Issued Special Order Number 15, which divided captured land into 40-acre plots and gave basically draft animals, mules, donkeys, horses that were going to be put down or freed to the slaves that were going to be given that land. And the reason why 40 acres and a mule is seen as a racist attack on African Americans is because Congress actually reversed his order and confiscated all of that from the freed slaves during Reconstruction. It's not going to be until January 1st, 1863 that the Battle of Antietam that he'll declare that Abraham Lincoln will do the Emancipation Proclamation and declare all slaves in the Confederacy freed. Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, all those states, they still have slavery. It's not until 1865 when they passed the 13th Amendment that ending slavery that the slaves in those states will be freed. And it was not an easy fight. Abraham Lincoln has to sell it as a way of punishing the South for the Civil War to get it passed, along with all kinds of shenanigans and political maneuvering. And, there's a whole movie about it. The movie Lincoln is really about the passing of the 13th Amendment. And it's a great movie. I really recommend it. So, Black Americans in the military. You would think, this being a war between the slaveholding Southern powers and the North, which theoretically does not support slavery, that this would be a no-brainer, right? You would want African Americans to be serving in the military. And as always with talking about white people in the 19th century, they're hella racist, and it is not that easy. Black Americans want to fight for freedom. The North needs more men. Seems like a match made in heaven, but no. This is very politically unpopular. So, like in all things where it's politically unpopular, the Lincoln administration vacillates. Sorry, they just put it on the back burner. The first Confiscation Act allows for the usage of freed slaves as labor, as scouts, as spies, saboteurs, and it isn't until the second Confiscation Act that allows the raising of actual regiments amongst contrabands, or basically using the idea that they're taking Black Americans as basically confiscating property. Yeah, it's a little gross. And they allow the raising of regiments from those people only. It isn't until the August of 1862, after a series of defeats, that they allow for the regular enlistment of free blacks in the North into the Union Army. Initially, these soldiers are only paid $10, but they have to pay $3 back to the Union Army for food and uniforms and ammunition and their weapon, which pointedly white soldiers do not have to pay this. It's something that only black soldiers have to do, whereas white soldiers make $13 a month, and don't have to pay any extra fees to the Army at all. Congress does eliminate this in 1864 and retroactively grants back pay to all of the black soldiers who served in the Civil War, and basically make it up to them. So they do see the light as the radical Republican seize control of Congress by this time, but it shows you, initially at least, like how poorly the North treats their black soldiers, though they do come around to them as the war continues. And what about the black soldiers in blue themselves? Well, they find it a lot harder to get good medical care. Initially, they're underpaid, though that does change. A big problem with the Civil War is that there's like 48 different guns being used. There's not a lot of standardization. Some of the weapons are incredibly low quality, especially particular rifles they were getting from Austria at the time, that Austria just phased out because they had a bad habit of exploding. Well, the Union Army is trying to buy every gun that they can possibly beg, borrow, or steal, so is the Confederate Army at the time. And as the good guns get brought in from, like, say, Springfield Armory, take a wild guess who gets to keep all the crappy exploding Austrian rifles? The black soldiers. They also are used mostly as labor in defensive or non-battle facing roles because they were seen as unreliable, though as the Civil War goes on and the numbers swell, that no longer becomes feasible, and you see them in more and more roles. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which we'll talk about in a second, gets mauled assaulting a fortress because even though it's the 1860s, all the rules for men with muskets trying to assault a fortified position still remain. By the end of the Civil War, there are 179,000 black soldiers and sailors serving in the Union. Only 80 of these will become officers. Most black regiments have white officers for the most part, and then black enlisted soldiers and non-commissioned officers. 10% of the Union Army, just under, will be black soldiers, and approximately 40,000 of these soldiers die, mostly from infection from bad medical care or disease, which is a major problem during the Civil War. 16 black soldiers will win the Medal of Honor, and their most famous unit is the aforementioned the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. They had white officers, black enlisted soldiers. They assault Fort Wagner in South Carolina, and they lose 2/3 of those officers and half of their men, and they're the guys that are immortalized in the film Glory. It's also worth noting that you do not want to get captured by the Confederacy if you are a black soldier in the Civil War. More often than not, they're not going to take you prisoner. They're just going to shoot you into a ditch and kill you for daring to rise up. Or they're going to effectively enslave you, use you for forced labor, whip you, torture you, work you to death. Ironically, one of the big things that happens with basically Union atrocities against the South is that because the North mistrusts abolitionists, and surprise, the military, as it turns out, is a democratically held organ. Most of the Union Army did not vote for Lincoln and are at least a little bit pro-slavery, at least slavery apathetic. But they put a lot of the abolitionists in charge of the military prisons to keep them away from forward-facing positions. Well, when the Southerners commit atrocities against black soldiers, the abolitionists start committing those same atrocities against Southern soldiers in order to basically hold the Confederate prisoners hostage against those of the black soldiers facing capture in battle. As we move on, you'll see the Anaconda Plan, the idea that the Union Navy is going to take the coast, and then the Union is going to move down the Mississippi and cut the Confederacy in half, and then the Confederacy is going to run out of weapons, they're going to run out of food. All they have is cotton, and it turns out you can't eat cotton and you can't shoot cotton at Union soldiers. So if they can cut off trade with Europe and the rest of the world and split the Confederacy in half so that Texas and Virginia, the only two parts of the Confederacy with any kind of industrialization, will not be able to basically pool their resources, the Confederacy is screwed. And this is this is the brainchild of General Winfield Scott, the greatest American hero up until this point. He served in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and is the General-in-Chief of the United States as this war begins. But he is in his 90s. He is so old that he cannot make it through a meeting of the War Cabinet without falling asleep and drooling on himself. So he's like, here's my plan. It involves no pitched battles, and the South will just automatically lose. And we don't have to really do anything, and we win. And everyone's like, oh, that's a great idea. Please retire. You're old and you're embarrassing us. Spoilers, this strategy used by others will be what really wins the Civil War. But the problem is this strategy is not satisfying to anybody. It doesn't look good in the press. It is a Fabian tactic. It's a tactic of disruption and of attrition. It doesn't lead to good news articles. So, due to the demands of the populace and politics, a lot of these bloody battles of the Civil War, totally pointless, totally unnecessary, except that if Abraham Lincoln loses the 1864 election, the North could surrender to the South, because if the Democrats take control or bring them back in with even greater power, and that's the ball game. So, mobilization. Before the Civil War, the United States Army was only 18,000 guys. And of these theoretical 18,000 men, as the Civil War kicks off, only 16,000 can be found. West Point produced the greatest number of and highest quality of officers, which a fifth of which go to the South, 168 of 724. The Confederate military would become 1 million men by the end of the Civil War, and the Union military would become just over 2 million men. And most of the Navy stays with the Union. So the soldiers fighting in the Civil War are mostly amateurs and rubes. They are worse than the militia that fought in the American Revolution in the War of 1812 because they have no training whatsoever, except the Southern troops are all militia trained, which results in a lot of their early victories. A lot of the Union soldiers have no military training at all, and these units are all low quality, poorly trained, ill-equipped, no standardization of strategy, and unable to use the, we talked about the importance of skilled soldiers and how badly skilled soldiers with muskets, and that is the primary weapon of the Civil War. Muskets, just rifled muskets instead of smoothbore muskets. They get one really nasty aimed volley off, and then the rest is just fire blindly into smoke with being deafened just like before. Which means that most battles in the Civil War are very sloppily fought, poorly manned, and instead of being able to launch assaults, they're just going to sit back and shoot each other, which we'll go a little more into in a second. What advantages the North have? Because I have to keep this under 45 minutes. They had a population of 21 million, whereas the South only had a population of 9 million. White people and 3.5 million enslaved African Americans. The Union had 9/10 of the country's industry. The rest is mostly in Virginia, a little bit in Texas. Also, 97% of all military weapons produced in the United States were produced in the North before the war. The United States Navy is still loyal, and the Union has naval supremacy over the waves, so the Anaconda Plan is basically 90% done before the war has even really begun. The Union has twice the number of railroads as the South does, which means they can move resources and coordinate much more readily. And the Union did not have a captive population that needed to be held in check, so they did not need to keep some of their militia troops at home to stop the slaves from rising up. The Southern advantage is that with the slave economy, a larger proportion of its white population could go to war, and since everybody had to serve in the slave patrols and the militia, they've got a lot more basic military training. Not good, high-quality military training, but they at least know the basics, more than the North has at this time. The South generally had superior political stability at the beginning of the war. The North thinks it's fighting maybe some for slavery, some to keep the Union intact, they guess, versus the South knows what they're fighting for. The South does not have to knock the North out of the war. The South is the size of all of Western Europe. They just have to survive, and they do have the home field advantage. Basically, they have to let the North break its fist on their face and then get tuckered out and then try to, and then have them surrender to them, essentially. And with the exception of West Point, all of the military academies in the entire United States are located in the South, not in the North. The South, as you can guess, also had better militias than the North did. So how is the Civil War fought? Civil War is fought much the same way that the War of 1812 and the American Revolution is fought, with muskets, infantry, artillery, and cavalry. Infantry falls into two strategies: engineering, which is sitting and shooting and building fortifications and trying to kill one another, and shock, which is fixing bayonets and assaulting. These armies are so slipshod and poorly led and poorly trained, many of them, having popular elections for their officers so that the guy who's everybody's friend is commanded. Well, what is the likelihood that they're going to order their men to fix bayonets and charge into withering volleys of gunfire? None. Cavalry is, once again, chronically misused. Since the days of Casimir Pulaski, the Union and the South have both basically forgotten how cavalry works entirely, and they just use them to scout out enemy positions, wreck railroad tracks, destroy the telegraph wires, raid for supplies. And with basically the wars are more or less fought the way those wars were with just slightly better weapons and a lot less discipline and a lot worse leadership, at least at the beginning of the war, and especially in the North at the beginning of the war. Is the Civil War a modern war? No, it's just a slightly fancier version of the previous wars. There were some repeating rifles and some Gatling guns and some fancy artillery, but it is by far the minority. And was the Civil War a total war? No, there was no sacking of cities. There was no the only burning of the city that happens in the whole war was an accident by Sherman using incendiary shells for the first time in the history of American warfare in a city that turned out to be primarily made of wood. There's no mass rape. There's no mass murder. The Sherman's March targeted property and burned homes and granaries and supplies. It didn't murder people. It didn't take the families of Confederate generals and shoot them into a ditch. There was no genocide involved. The Civil War is even more genteelly fought, for the most part, than even the American Revolution was. And anyone who tells you otherwise is outdated, lying to you, or politically motivated. So, moving along as quickly as I can to make so this recording software doesn't vomit. The First Battle of Manassas is on July 21st, 1861. Both sides believe the victory will be swift. Both sides say it will be over by Christmas. By the way, if anyone ever says that to you, it's never over by Christmas. The Southern General Beauregard defeats Union General McDowell despite being outnumbered. Both armies are poorly trained and poorly led. The only guy who seems to know what he's doing is General Thomas Jackson, who hides his men behind a stone wall. We already discussed during the American Revolution chapter the value of being able to hide behind a wall. And he gets the nickname Stonewall Jackson for his heroism at this battle. He is the sole sane man in a skilled general in a field full of people who barely know what they're doing. There are three theaters in the Civil War which we mostly talk about. The Eastern Theater, which is basically just Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. The Western Theater is everything south of Virginia and east of the Mississippi River. And the Trans-Mississippi is everything west of the Mississippi River and east of California. So, with the First Battle of Bull Run having happened, everyone decides that suddenly the cause is lost, the Confederates can't be beat, and there must be strictly better than them, and morale plummets in the North, and morale goes way up in the South. In early 1862, General Halleck for the Union gave Ulysses S. Grant control in the field. He bloodlessly takes the forts Donelson and Henry, then marches on Nashville, Tennessee, cutting the railroads between the Upper South, the West, and the Deep South. The Army of Tennessee, which is 40,000 strong, struck up from Mississippi and met Grant's army of 63,000 men at the Battle of Shiloh, which happened between April 6th and April 7th, resulting in 11,000 casualties for the Confederates and 13,000 casualties for the Union. And it is a Union victory. But tell you the scale of warfare happening compared to the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War and the American Revolution, this battle has more casualties than every previous American war combined. That is the scale of fighting that is happening here. And on April 25th, the U.S. Navy takes control of New Orleans, and that cuts off trade in and out of the Mississippi River. And by mid-June, Corinth and Memphis fell to the Union, and all trade on the Mississippi River is controlled by the Union. And the Confederacy's largest city and port is in Union hands, and the Anaconda Plan is over, and the war is effectively won. Good game. But as I said, it's not really satisfying. It's just going to slowly and successfully strangle the South to death. And that's not any fun. That doesn't play well in the papers. It seems cowardly. And so we're going to fight 3 more years of this war for basically no reason. And this introduces us to a big problem in the Civil War. You're only as successful as last week's press. And the press is very partisan. It's drama. And the other thing is, all of the people that are doing the press are in Virginia and on the East Coast. Nobody's in the West. So the Union is going to win all but one battle in the West all war long, with Sherman and Sheridan and Grant winning everything all the time. Well, Lee wins in the East, where all the reporters and the telegraph lines are, and it's close to D.C. So all the people in the Union hear almost all war long is how Lee is winning everything and the North sucks. which gives a slanted view that the North fought the Civil War more poorly than the South, and it just isn't true. Continuing. In 1862 in the East, Winfield Scott retires. In 1861, a guy named General George McClellan is made General-in-Chief and leader of the Army of the Potomac. He spent early 1861 building the Army. He does a great job training, equipping, and organizing the Union Army, and that closes a lot of the gap in 1861 between the Southern militiamen and Northern soldiers. After early 1862, he does not do anything, though. He just trains, and wanting action, Halleck, who just won a bunch of stuff in the West, is made General-in-Chief, but McClellan stays in charge of the Army of the Potomac. In March of that year, McClellan attacks Richmond from the east between York and James River in the Peninsular Campaign, captures a swath from Hampton Roads, the outskirts of Richmond. Johnston is injured in the Battle of Seven Pines during this campaign, a battle that is inconclusive, though the Potomac kills more Confederates than the Confederate kills Union soldiers. McClellan becomes convinced that there's a non-existent Southern army on their flank that will cut them off, so he just retreats and gives up everything. Because Johnston is injured, Robert E. Lee takes command of the Army of Northern Virginia, and between the 25th and July 1st, forces McClellan away from Richmond down the peninsula, erases most of McClellan's gains, and the North fails to win and take Richmond and end the war. And this once again erases the idea of Union successes in the West from the public eye and continues to boost up the South while hurting Northern morale. Now, this is where the war of opinion in North and copyrightism I just discussed, how you're only as good as your last battle in the North, and the North is psyching itself out even though they've basically already won. And copyrightism is simply the fact that there are a lot of Northerners who were involved in the cotton economy who are not in favor of the North winning the Civil War and ending the Cotton Kingdom, and they actually side with the South to the tune of terrorism, pro-Southern terrorism in New York City and other places. In 1862, in the East, Pope was given command of the Union Army at this point and portions of the Army of Potomac in the Eastern McClellan after he screws up. Pope promptly marches to his own defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run against Lee between August 28th and the 30th. McClellan was then put back in charge. Lee counterattacks into Western Maryland. They meet at the Battle of Antietam, which is the bloodiest day of the war, on September 17th, 1862. The Union Army loses almost 13,000 men. The Confederacy's almost 11. McClellan wins, but he doesn't pursue the Confederate Army. He doesn't destroy the Confederate Army, which is a serious problem throughout the war. Because the armies are so poorly led and poorly manned, they allow the other side always to get away and continue fighting rather than hunting them down and destroying them or butchering them with a bayonet charge at the end because they don't have the discipline to do it. So battles never really accomplish anything in Civil War. They're just useless bloodbaths for the most part, other than swaying public opinion. The Emancipation Proclamation, September 22nd, 1862, in honor of the victory at Antietam, Lincoln made his Emancipation Proclamation freeing all Southern slaves in parts of the South still under Confederate control. This causes a massive backlash during that year's congressional election, as it's seen as an overreach for executive power. It hurts Republican control of the House, and it goes into effect on January 1st, 1863. The Battle of Fredericksburg happens December 11th through the 15th, 1862. A general named Burnside is destroyed at the Battle of Fredericksburg. His army assaulted a Confederate low stone wall position across mud and was shot to pieces. Burnside tries to do it again, and then it rains heavily, and the ground is even muddier, even messier. It's impossible to advance. His men, two of his officers, go to D.C. They get to see the president. Lincoln orders them to halt. A conspiracy is fermented that almost turns into a coup d'etat against the Lincoln administration. I am rushing here. Burnside is ultimately court-martialed in front of Congress itself and replaced with his rival, General Joseph Hooker, who was a hard-partying Republican who hated Burnside's guts and had loose ladies that followed the army known as Hooker's girls. That's where we get the word hooker from in the American context. In the East, in 1863, you have the Enrollment Act, which is the first draft in American history, which leads to rioting in the city of New York. Hooker attacks Chancellorsville and loses, and is defeated by Robert E. Lee. Stonewall Jackson is mortally wounded by friendly fire, and Hooker is sacked over his defeat here. After the Enrollment Act and continuous defeat in battle after battle, the Democrats are going to look like they're going to win the election in 1864. George McClellan is running as a pro-peace Democrat against Lincoln. And this is where the Battle of Gettysburg is so important here, and why it's the most important battle of the war, in the same way that Saratoga is the most important battle of the war. Because he attacks Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1st through the 3rd. I have notes there about how it happened. Well, because of this massive victory for the Union, they save Lincoln's bacon in the election and guarantees that the Union is going to win. As I said, they've completed the Anaconda strategy. They're going to win. This is going to stop the pro-Southern Democrats from winning the election. Meade, of course, fails to pursue or destroy Lee's army, so Lee gets to fight another day, and not much is solved, except it's a key political moment for Lincoln. However, in the West, General Grant continues to win everything. He launches his famous assault on Vicksburg, which is one of the last Confederate holdouts in the Mississippi region. He wins a series of 5 small battles and does a 6-week siege where he captures the Confederate army and then makes them surrender unconditionally, taking a Confederate army out of the field for the first time in the entire war. And this is where Lincoln realizes he's got his guy. And this is why Grant will be made commander-in-chief of the entire Union military at this point, because he's the only one actually winning battles conclusively. In September 19th or 20th, through the 20th, the Army of Tennessee gets their first and only victory of the whole war, defeating the Army of Cumberland at Battle of Chickamauga, and only because Longstreet's elite men from the Army of Northern Virginia showed up suddenly, and that also erases the Vicksburg victory from the public discourse, but whatever. Grant and Rosecrans siege and capture the railroad hub of Chattanooga immediately after this in a 2-month-long siege. Chattanooga falls on the 25th, and Rosecrans takes the Army of the Cumberland, maneuvers Bragg's Army of Tennessee back into Georgia with almost no casualties. The Army of Tennessee has been beaten so badly that they refuse to fight. In 1864 in the East, Grant is made General-in-Chief of the Union Army, takes control of the Army of Potomac, and locks Lee and most of the Army of Northern Virginia into just a series of bloody battles called the Overland Campaign. He's just pinning Lee in place. A guy named Jubal Early takes part of Lee's army in autumn and attempts to attack D.C. and fails. And while this is all happening, General Sheridan does a flanking action through the Shenandoah Valley, counters Early, and drives all the Confederate forces from the Shenandoah Valley in an aggressive series of cavalry battles. Nobody knows how to correctly use cavalry as the shock arm of the army in the Civil War except Sheridan, who is a Union officer. In the West, William Tecumseh Sherman has taken over command and outmaneuvers General Joseph Johnston, who is now back in command of the Army of Tennessee, all the way back to the city of Atlanta with very few pitched battles, because he knows that if Sherman catches him, Sherman is going to destroy him. The Union Army attacks from New Orleans into Alabama with a lot of black soldiers, and the Army stalls and gets into war of attrition. The Union loses hard, declares the South is winning the war again, even though that's obviously ridiculous. John Bell Hood, who's leader of the Army of Northern Virginia's famous Texan Regiment, master of shock warfare, takes control of the Army of Tennessee. Unfortunately, it turns out that Hood is a crazy person. Sherman, basically digs into Atlanta and says, "Come in, it's a suicide pact. Come in and fight me." And Sherman's like, "No thanks," cuts off Hood from supplies by cutting the railroad into the city and forces Hood to withdraw, and takes Atlanta from Hood on September 1st without a fight. Hood is defeated by General Rosecrans at the Battle of Franklin on November 30th, 1864. He sends large portions of his army to their death on purpose who he felt were cowardly without support. And he breaks his own army's morale, and the Army of Tennessee is basically a non-factor at this point. I've read Hood's memoirs. He glorifies that he did this. The Army of Tennessee is all but destroyed at the Battle of Nashville on December 15th through the 16th by George Thomas, basically a B-list general. And the 15th through the 20th is the famous March to the Sea, which is from Atlanta to Charleston, South Carolina, and destroys infrastructure, supplies, the property of Confederate officers and politicians. He also frees all the slaves that he encounters, which is one of the reasons why they hate him so much. And he accidentally burns Charleston to the ground, as I said before. And finally, in 1865, there are 3 more months of Sherman and Sheridan closing in on Lee, who's still pinned. The Battle of Cold Harbor sees Grant form his army into Napoleonic attack columns and does actual shock 19th century tactics now that the noose has been set, and he shatters Lee's army of Northern Virginia and pushes them in. The Confederate Army runs out of supplies. The North cuts them off, and on April 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders. And the war is formally ended on May 9th. And on June 22nd, the last shots are fired by some remnants of the Army of Tennessee that had basically put themselves into the hills. Whew, we got it there just before 45 minutes. Please read the announcements for this week. They're super important. I'm sorry I had to run through this so quickly. Please read through the notes at your own time. Look up the Battle of Franklin and General John Bell Hood. He is a crazy person who is obsessed with the fact that he is a cripple and that he has a beautiful wife and that he is not man enough, and thus projects that onto his fellow men and officers, leading to their early demise. It is super interesting. It's one of the areas I did my focus on for my master's. Anyway, I hope you guys have had a great day, and thank you for watching my lecture.